It's the witching hour of 10 o'clock. So maybe I'll just start now then to introduce you. I wanted to mention to the class that they shouldn't need any reminding. This is the last class of PLATO. It started in somewhere around 2010, I think. And I've enjoyed doing it. It's a fairly time-consuming enterprise, but I've enjoyed it immensely. The people who have been participating as speakers, the people who've been participating as questioners, I think it's been a really fine group. And I feel honored that you are presenting this special edition of 30 slides, which I thoroughly enjoyed glancing at before, because they deal with this transition from hydroelectric to nuclear very well. And a lot of people don't know even what CANDO stands for, let alone the reasons for its rejection, probably by the NRC in Canada, and its acceptance around the world elsewhere. So I'm looking forward to more details from you on that, Neil, and thank you very much for coming. So,
oh, go ahead. Sorry.
You have the floor. Except I think I pretty much said that we have 30 slides. That's lots of gives us lots of time to discuss them through the way, and I'm very grateful for you doing this. I feel it's a favor, especially to me, and I hope the rest of the group enjoy it as much as I do. So you have the floor.
Thank you, Richard, and I feel honored to take up this position as the last one, and also a little bit frightened by it, and wishing I'd gone back and done a better job of some of the research I've done to live up to expectations. As you said, Richard, you invited me on this one, and then you sent me a stream of questions of things that you would be interested in. And I have to say, they took me out of my comfort zone in a number of areas. And in some ways, I want to thank you for it, because I learned a lot, and I always enjoy learning things. In other ways, I want to curse you for it, because in learning a lot, I realized how little I knew, and in fact, how difficult it was sometimes to get answers to specific questions off the internet. You can try asking them, and I tried even these new AI solutions, and they just keep coming back to stuff, but nobody seems to have wanted to provide the information that I was looking for. So that's why I cursed you a little bit for it.
Well, maybe it enhances Bucephalus consulting in general.
I can now bore people for even longer when I go to a bar in an evening.
There you go.
On a wide range of new subjects that could trigger that. But anyway, yeah, when I put it all together, you were asking a lot about what Canada has done, and basically the history and what we're doing now. And I wanted to talk a little bit about what we're doing in the future. So that gave me the inspiration to call it the past, the present, and the future, and to talk about what Canada's doing in nuclear power. This is your questions are in black, and then my questions are the ones that I thought you needed to answer in order to make it a comprehensive presentation. And as everybody can see, there's a lot of material here, and it starts with the history. How did Canada get into CANDOs, which Richard's alluded to a number of times, and it stands for Canadian Deuterium Uranium, and it basically captures the primary features of the CANDO reactor. And we go through that. We go through how it fits into our energy system, where we are today, and then finishes off with what the future of CANDO may or may not be, and some of the things that are coming into play that people have never thought about that really make a difference, that actually rely on features of the CANDO reactor. And then we finish off with what Canada is actually doing, which isn't CANDO related, but could make a very big difference to the way nuclear power is seen around the world. So that's basically the story. In doing so, normally I like to just use a series of pictures and then use my memory to talk about what's there. On this occasion, because I've been going into new territory and my memory is increasingly failing me. We have slides with a fair amount of text on them, some of which I am going to need to read, but hopefully I can riff off that text and talk a little bit more widely about the subjects. And one of the things I do want to say is if people have questions, please ask me as I go along, and I will do the best I can to answer them. So why did Canada get interested in heavy water reactors and why? And deuterium, for those that don't know, is the heavy isotope of hydrogen, and deuterium is what's used. Deuterium oxide, heavy water, is what's used as the moderator in the CANDU reactors and is the key to the whole system. And the reason why Canada went the CANDU route in popular history is because at the end of the Second World War, Canada wanted to have a nuclear program, but it didn't have the capacity to make some of the large vessels that it used for pressure water reactors and boiling water reactors. But it wanted to be able to do it with its indigenous industry. So it was looking for reactors that had smaller components. That was only possible because we had access to heavy water. And the reason Canada had access to heavy water is a whole series of accidents that came together that put Canada in a position to hold stocks of heavy water and understand it. And it basically started with a Russian-born scientist before or during the war, and recognized that heavy water was going to be important. I was kind of really looking forward into what could happen during the war. And so I'm going to have to remember the story, but they'd been developing a reactor and they ended up going to the UK. And when the UK decided to relocate its program, it sent the Cambridge program out to Canada because it was a safer place to run the program. Simultaneously, over on the west coast of Canada, quite by accident, there was a chemist that was interested in heavy water who set up a heavy water production facility out in the west. And one of the reasons that's beneficial is that if you're producing heavy water, you need a lot of electricity, and so you need to be near a plentiful source of hydro, otherwise, and later on nuclear electricity. Otherwise, you're going to have a very expensive approach to producing heavy water. At the start of the Second World War, there was only one place producing heavy water. It was in Norway, and they had 185 kilograms of it. And it basically got smuggled around the world. So whatever everybody thought was happening when drums of water were being moved around, one wonders. But it started in Norway. The French recognized its value. They wanted it in France. It moved to the UK because that was the quickest route to get it out of Norway. It then moved down into France, and then as France was invaded, it came out of the south of France and went back up into the UK before it was all shipped to Canada in order to support the program. It was the knowledge that we had about heavy water and about heavy water reactors that allowed Canada to develop the CANDU reactor and allowed us to develop a reactor that we could make out of indigenous components without having to go abroad for the large vessels that I talked about earlier. So it was that intrigue of history during the Second World War that ended up with Canada having production facilities for heavy water, having knowledge about heavy water, having knowledge about heavy water reactors, and therefore the ability to move forward and develop them.
Could I ask you a question at this point? I think you're going to cover it, But as I understand, the heavy water contributes about 11% of the cost, or something in that neighborhood of the ultimate product of electricity. And my question is, presumably you can recycle most of it, but I'm curious to know how much of it gets lost, and if is most of the 11% just in acquiring it in the first place.
So yeah, most of the 11% is acquiring it in the first place. It's very expensive stuff. It's difficult to make, and because you're separating one isotope of hydrogen from another, and there isn't a great deal of difference between the two. So it's a challenging system to operate, which is why it requires so much power and a lot of effort. That said, heavy water isn't destroyed in the process at all. So it sits there as the moderator. And in the CANDUs, it's both the moderator and the coolant in order to give us the neutron efficiency. So it's not destroyed by the process, it just sits there.
Right.
It does, however, get contaminated with tritium.
Uh-huh.
So one of the disbenefits and potentially a benefit of the CANDU system is that the neutrons cause tritium to be produced as a result of interactions with the deuterium. And that leads to the radiation levels in the nuclear facility steadily increasing. And so some of the plants take their tritium, take their heavy water out, and then have the tritium removed for it before returning it to the plant. So it is recycled from that point of view, but it's not actually destroyed in the process. And so once you've bought your heavy water, it's your heavy water and it sits there for the lifetime of the plant. And at the end of the lifetime of the plant, you can then sell it to another plant.
Okay.
I had some distortions in my computer here. How are the isotopes separated?
So yeah, I knew as soon as I went into that, I was going to get asked. And there are a variety of techniques, all of which are more complicated than I was able to understand. But they're just they are feeding off the very slight weight difference between the hydrogen and deuterium, which means that it interacts at different speeds. The chemical reactions will all end up being the same, but they end up happening at different speeds. And a number of people have worked out various different chemical ways of filtering out one because it moves faster into a chemical reaction, and then keep on doing it until you have sufficient concentration of the deuterium, deuterated water in your system to be able to operate it.
Thank you.
So, one of the things that was involved in all the history, you may have seen the movie The Telemark Heroes. The Allies were absolutely desperate to stop the Germans producing heavy water, and there were a number of very brave and complex raids on the heavy water plant to try and destroy it in Norway so that they would stop the production, which led in the end to the blowing up of a ferry with the entire German stock of heavy water, which then sank in a field in Norway and stopped them having access to it. Many years later, they went back down to recover the drums of heavy water, which had been preserved as a lesson in trying to learn just how close the Germans were to being able to produce a heavy water reactor and then potentially a nuclear weapon. And they found that actually they had almost completely failed to concentrate the heavy water in any form after the Russians left and stopped helping them with it. So it was a very brave exercise. It turns out at the end of the day, it was somewhat unnecessary, but it did mean that the Germans never got a weapon during the Second World War.
Thank goodness
So
for that.
that's how we ended up with it. And then this is the Canadian deuterium uranium reactor. So the one of the great advantages we'll come to is that because you have a greater neutron efficiency, you don't need to enrich your fuel. So that's where the uranium comes from, because it's unenriched uranium. The deuterium obviously comes from the heavy water. And instead of having a vessel like you have in a pressure water reactor or a boiling water reactor, you have a series of pipes or tubes in which the CANDU fuel is held in bundles. So on the bottom right of this slide, you can see a CANDU bundle inside one of the fuel tubes. And then the heavy water is circulated on the outside of, or between those two tubes. And if you look at the big picture in the middle, you can see that what you end up with is an amazing array of the tubes that make up the core of the reactor, and the feeder tubes coming in from the side that are required to get the water into the pipes that in which the fuel exists.
And if I may raise a question, one of the beauties of this is that you don't have to shut down for 3 months or however long. It's now taking a bit less time. The old-fashioned conventional reactors, you can keep changing these as needed while you're still generating power, I believe.
That's correct. And so if you see the picture there, the graphic that's just below my logo, you can see that the tubes go through the middle of what's called a calandria. The calandria also keeps a body of heavy water, and that heavy water is needed to moderate the neutrons and maintain that fuel efficiency so that we have much greater interaction of the neutrons with the fuel. But that's held in a calandria. At either end of the calandria, there are fueling machines that can access each one of the tubes individually and shuffle the fuel in the smaller, the bundles are about 1 meter long, so they're quite easy to handle. And you can shuffle the fuel through the core using the fueling machines. And that, as you said, Richard, means that you don't have to shut the reactor down to refuel. You can just refuel it while it's operating using the fueling machines, putting fresh fuel in at one end and shuffling used fuel out at the far end.
Nice.
Obviously, one of the fun things about CANDU reactor for neutronics scientists is that they are constantly calculating how best to shuffle the fuel in order to make most efficient use of it.
Quick question, Neil. What kind of fuel is it? You say it's not very concentrated uranium. Which kind of uranium? And
so it's natural uranium. There is no upgrading of the uranium whatsoever, and it's formed into a uranium oxide pellet.
Okay.
Pellets, it's a centimeter and a bit long, and equivalently round. So they make a small pellet of uranium oxide, and that then goes into the fuel tubes that are then made into bundles.
Gotcha. So it's just whatever the mix is of 235 and U238,
as it comes out of the ground. Yeah.
As it comes out of the ground.
We don't have to go into the whole upgrading problem. That keeps us clear of proliferation issues because we can't upgrade it to weapons grade material, and it saves a lot of the cost, which we're going to come to in a second. So going back to, I don't think I addressed this one, going back to Richard's issue about 11% of the cost coming from heavy water, that's actually typically recovered straight away, or comparatively straight away, because when you're fueling a PWR using enriched fuel, the fuel is that much more expensive. So the heavy water and the additional initial fueling costs kind of balance themselves out in terms of the reactor economics. So I am told. I am not an economist. So,
one other question. You mentioned the Germans couldn't make this reactor, and they wanted to make a bomb, which means they wanted to enrich. So how it can have an enrichment possibility, or it seems like there's some enrichment capability with it. No.
No. So what the Germans would have been doing is using the neutrons that they could produce to irradiate the fuel, and then they get plutonium. So they would have been looking, or the theory was they would have been looking for a plutonium bomb rather than an enriched uranium bomb. I think the historians are now saying that it doesn't look like they ever had a weapons program at all, and actually that they were already doing research on civil nuclear reactors and had no intentions of making a bomb. But the people during the Second World War wouldn't have known that, and the Germans wouldn't have told them. So it was a good gamble to make sure they couldn't.
Yes, thank you.
So these I tried to do a balance here. So obviously in Canada, we think that the benefits of CANDO are so great that the world should have had them. But to be fair, there are both benefits and disbenefits. So I've tried to summarize the main ones here. On the upside, as Richard rightly pointed out, you have online refueling. So you can get a much better capacity factor for your reactors because you don't have to stop them for refueling. You only ever have to stop them for replacing components and updating stuff and things like that. So we've actually had reactors operate for 3 years without a break. And I think they may be even increasing that. Because you don't need to stop them to refuel them. You only need to stop when you recognize you have an issue of maintenance. You can use natural uranium. You've got a lot of neutron flexibility. The deuterium actually is a worse moderator than regular hydrogen, but it doesn't absorb the neutrons. So you get many more moderated neutrons than you would if you use water, which is why the PWRs have to have enriched fuels because they're losing a lot being absorbed into the natural water. The fact that you have fuel flexibility means you can use natural uranium fuel, or you can do a whole variety of other things. So it gives flexibility to use thorium if you want to, and there have also been plans to use used PWR fuel reconfigured because you can get more burn up out of it by putting it into a CANDO reactor. That's not so affected by the poisons. So people have looked into that, and it gives the flexibility. Currently, the economics don't demand that anyone does that. Uranium is, although it's gone up a lot in price recently, is still relatively inexpensive. And the other benefits are not sufficiently valuable to do that. So presently, no one's doing that, but the system does allow you to do that. It gave Canada supply chain security. I think we've all started to realize what a challenge supply chains can be. As we had, first of all, the COVID situation where supply chains broke down and stuff couldn't be moved across borders as easily as it used to. And then more recently or almost immediately thereafter with the war in Ukraine, we became aware of just how much Russian stuff we rely on and just how much Ukrainian stuff we rely on. And I think a lot of countries have started to say, my apologies, everyone, I'm getting talking too much. For strategically important things, countries would like to know that they can manage it themselves. So we have supply chain security, not just of all of our components, which we can supply from within Canada, but we have supply chain security of our fuel because we don't need to go to another country to upgrade the fuel. And that could be a mammoth advantage for other countries because upgrading fuel is a real expensive challenge, and it also has a whole load of proliferation challenges associated with it. So it's a very limited opportunity. And the other advantage of CANDOs is they are very stable machines. Nothing happens very quickly in a CANDO. So things change, but you can manage them, spot them happening, and control them. It has lots and lots of components, lots and lots of valves, So if any one valve fails, there's typically, dozens of others that are also carrying the same load, and it can just be diverted and the issue can be challenged. Where PWRs and BWRs tend to have much, single components or double components, and very large ones. So if they fail, they become much more of a challenge much more quickly. So reactor operators kind of like CANDO, because you can go to sleep and just leave them to get on with the job without having to actively manage them in quite the same way. So we talk a lot about those advantages, but CANDOs do come with some disadvantages. So Richard was referring to the fact that we approved them for use in Canada, and they've been approved for use in a number of other countries around the world. Romania, Argentina, China, the ones that immediately come to mind. But America did have a problem with them. We like to think that that's largely because you were kind of trying to secure your own market and didn't want the superior Canadian technology from coming in and stealing American companies' market share. But it could also be to do with the fact that they have a positive void coefficient, which is a bit of a safety challenge in that what it means is that if things start to lose control and the system begins to overheat, then as you form a void in the steam, then the reactor power starts going up, and the control system becomes harder and harder to control. And that's kind of something that people would like to avoid in nuclear reactors. It's actually quite easy to manage. So you just have control systems that watch what's happening and prevent you ever getting into that scenario. But it is something that if you write your regulatory system so that you want to get rid of that, then accepting a reactor that has a positive void coefficient becomes something of a challenge. The use of natural uranium means that your burn up is much less. It means that you use a lot more fuel, and then you have a lot higher used fuel volumes. I don't see that as a particular problem. It doesn't make a difference to the size of the repository. As soon as you get a repository accepted, the used fuel volume doesn't make a great deal of difference to anything. But it is conspicuous that CANDOs have that higher used fuel volume. In terms of the cost of fuel, it kind of balances out, and in fact, CANDO fuel is that much cheaper because you don't have to upgrade it. That you're using much less ore to make that fuel in the first place. So the ore demand is, I think, 30% lower in order to make the fuel that would produce the same amount of energy as a PWR. One of the downsides at the moment of CANDO reactors is they produce tritium. Tritium's pretty hard to manage. We have to go through the process of recovering it out of the moderator and coolant. Otherwise, the doses to workers in the reactors increase. But as we'll see in a second, tritium production could actually become an advantage. And so as well as being an advantage of having lots of components and giving the reactor stability, having lots of components is also a big disadvantage because you're forever swapping stuff out because it has a tendency to go wrong. So maintenance programs are much bigger in CANDO reactors. All in all, like many things in life, CANDO reactors and PWRs, BWRs kind of compete, with some people preferring one and other people preferring the other. At the end of the day, the costs all kind of balance out, and the costs of operation all kind of balance out. So they have upsides and downsides, and it's up to you to choose which you like and which you don't like. Things are, though, changing because one of the benefits of the CANDO reactor is you can get access to those plentiful neutrons. So PWRs and BWRs, the core is quite distant and quite inaccessible. And so it's difficult to use to make isotopes. But in CANDUs, the cores are quite easy to access, and so we can produce isotopes. And I'm going to talk a lot later on about the benefits of doing that and what's happening in the isotope space. But it is a huge differentiating feature of CANDUs, so that it's not only solved a world problem, which we'll come to in a bit, but it means that if people want a security of supply of their own isotopes, then having a CANDU reactor is a really beneficial way of doing that, especially if you need the power as well. So Richard talked earlier on about coal, and I think, you know, he was making a point about how Ontario got to where it is. And actually, one of the amazing things that you know, people forget about, but which nuclear gave to Ontario. So we got used to electricity because we had access to plentiful electricity from Niagara Falls. And people saw the benefits of having plentiful electricity in terms of your ability to manage and build your economy. During the 50s and 60s, electricity was what allowed you to become a manufacturing region. But most people were doing that with coal. And Canada, Ontario in particular, didn't have access to easy access to coal. So it would have to be shipped large distances across borders in order to give Canada access to that plentiful electricity, which it had realized is really beneficial to building your economy.
Like we do in Wisconsin, coming in by the trainload every day from the West. Really a shocker.
It is. And the fact is that Ontario would probably never have become a manufacturing powerhouse if we hadn't built the nuclear reactors, because it would have been too expensive to have coal. That would have increased our manufacturing costs. We would never have become a manufacturing province. So, you know, some of our nuclear reactors, like many nuclear reactors around the world, went over cost. They more expensive than people thought, and a lot of the anti-nuclear people will come back and say, you know, but it ended up with us having to spend a lot to support the build of that nuclear program. And I'm going, yes, but we had a manufacturing base, and that's what pays for all of our jobs and the wealth that we have in the province. Otherwise, we would have just been probably a relatively poor agricultural province.
Thanks. That's a really good statement. I'm so glad you made that, because you know, Ontario, it has agriculture, but it does have a huge industrial base, having lived there, and I'm so impressed when you look at that table that I keep sharing with people, called the 8 large areas of the world that have don't have a coal in their production, and 3 of those 8 economies are in Canada. Of course,
Right.
British Columbia uses a lot of western mountains for hydropower, and Quebec has this vast area of waterfall going into the eastern shoreline of Hudson Bay, and that makes those states purely hydro. But Ontario, I think, would have never developed into the industrial center that it is if it hadn't, and at least be part of those 8 units if it were not for its nuclear contribution.
That's true. And then the other area of the world that did the same thing was France. So
Yeah.
France has a big nuclear fleet.
Sure.
They have clean electricity. They managed to build an economy. They had limited access to hydro and almost no access to fossil fuels, but were still used their nuclear investment to go on and do that.
Dottie, you have a question. Do you want to use it now?
Yes, I wondered whether any of the nuclear power in Ontario is finds its way into the United States.
So I missed the middle of that question.
I was wondering whether any of the nuclear power in Ontario is transmitted across the border to the United States.
Yeah, so Canada's grid and the US grid are entirely integrated. So electricity has throughout history moved back and forwards over the border quite freely. And one of the original justifications for building so much nuclear power in Ontario was that we would export it to the US. And exports took place on a bulk scale for quite some time. But now we have the issue that our population has grown and our demand for electricity is so high that mostly we're using it. And the big challenge is that we need to build a lot more quite quickly in order to meet our own demand. That said, peaks and troughs occur at different times. And so electricity will swap backwards and forwards over the border in order to meet those peaks and troughs.
Thank you.
So this is a graph. Sorry, this is just a table laying out what did happen. So we weren't able to build nuclear fast enough to meet all of the demand of the province. So there was some coal generation taking place, and there was a decision taken. When people started getting excited about the potential for greenhouse gases to cause climate change, to try and move Ontario off coal. And we were able to do that. So here you'll see in 2003, coal was being used for 25% of our generation. And in 2014, it went down to 0, and it's still 0 today. So we have no coal being burnt in Canada for electricity production. At the same time, we had a lot of investment in wind and solar power, the non-hydro renewables, and they tried to claim credit for us moving off coal because it happened at the time that they did that. And here you can see that during that time, the percentage went from 0% to 7%. But at the same time, if you look at the nuclear figure, it went from 42% to 60%. So I'm fairly sure that mathematically you can prove that it was really the expansion in the nuclear fleet that took place that really enabled us to move off coal, and wind and solar didn't really do all that much. But they're still trying to claim credit for it. One of the things that I found funny, and this was one of the areas that they did it, and I had actually had a fairly massive argument on the internet with someone about this. So one of our coal-fired power stations was not far from me, just along the coast on Lake Erie to my west. The Nanticoke power station, where obviously we could ship coal in from the US across down the Great Lakes. That produced about 4 gigawatts of electricity and was a baseload power generator, reliably putting it into the system whenever we wanted it. And they decided to close Nanticoke. And as part of the deal, they set up a solar farm within the grounds of the Nanticoke power station. And all of the green newspapers and a lot of the more reputable newspapers were suckered into headlines that said things like, solar replaces coal at Nanticoke. And I tried to hunt for a headline. Believe me, they did have them, but they've all been retired off the internet. So what they were claiming is that we swapped out 4 gigawatts of reliable power for 44 megawatts of occasional power, and that was a replacement. So that's but I actually argued with somebody on the internet who said it was a direct replacement. And I'm going, 44 megawatts of occasional power is not the same as 4 gigawatts of reliable power. But it is the kind of thing that the nuclear industry has had to fight with as people misunderstand the way information is presented to them. What difference does it make? So we'll see. And I thought I had a slide here that showed the CO2 output. And maybe that comes next. But a big difference that it made is the number of smog days. Now, people will argue about this because there were other changes taking place, and some of our smog was caused by the American plants who were also changing the way they produced electricity. But smog used to be a big challenge in Toronto, and where I live here, we used to be able to smell the Nanticoke plant. And so in 2004, when we were still having those smog days, there were 1,700 people estimated to die in Toronto each year prematurely as a result of lung issues brought on by the smog and basically the burning of fossil fuels. The number of smog days has been reduced to pretty much zero. So we've not had smog in Toronto in the last 5 years. We had a big issue with smoke coming from forest fires last year, but we haven't had any smog caused by deliberate burning of fossil fuels for 5 years.
How do you distinguish those?
Sorry?
How do you distinguish those two?
I think just in terms of looking at the data on the days that it happens.
Okay.
So the smoke effect that we got here was very, very obvious, and you could like see it on satellite pictures as it moved down from the forest fires and came and settled over Toronto.
Okay.
Caused me huge problems with allergies. This wasn't gonna cause me a problem, but it was just really brutal for a while as we dealt with that. The reduction in smog has had a direct effect on the number of hospitalizations from lung challenges brought on by air pollution, down from 1,700 to 1,300. So 400 people didn't die last year as a result of that reduction in smog. So as well as the CO2 issue, getting rid of coal has contributed to that change in the cleanliness of our air. So, and certainly the people along the lakefront where I live will talk about the days that we used to have when Nanticoke operated and the wind was blowing in our direction and how you could smell it, and we never have that anymore. So getting rid of coal has that benefit. It didn't maybe later on there's one with the CO2 emissions. I vividly remember creating it, but you can see the data in the CO2 emissions as well that shows how we've reduced that along with the coal, with getting rid of coal. Richard asked me a little bit about water and how the hydro system works. And that was quite a fascinating little investigation for me as well. So the water pours down the Niagara River and is then used in some fairly massive hydroelectric plants, one on either side of the border. So as you look at this picture, the left-hand side is the US, the right-hand side is Canada. And all of that is done through major international agreements between the US and Canada that allows us to share the water. 56,500 cubic feet of water per second is allowed to go to American power stations, to Canadian power stations, and 32,500 cubic feet per second goes into the Canadian ones. And this leads me to one of the issues that I really wanted to investigate further, but I couldn't get an answer to at all. And that is that if we're drawing nearly twice as much water, why are we producing less electricity with it than the US is? Because the US gets 2,700 megawatts and we get 2,000 megawatts. So there's a big difference there. And I have no idea why it is. I do not believe that the hydroelectric efficiencies could explain that difference. So there's something else going on.
Well, isn't the size of the tunnel huge on the Canadian side? I understood you could put a church inside that tunnel.
So I was going to lead to that.
Okay.
So the water on the American side flows directly into their holding reserve above ground. And so this may make the difference to the efficiency, although I'm not sure how. But the water flow in Canada is very complex. So we have water being drawn from well up above Niagara Falls, and it flows through tunnels underneath the Canadian city of Niagara Falls into the storage reservoirs. So it all goes through tunnels, which are, as Richard says, quite massive. And we have recently been expanding ours. So that could mean that the amount of electricity we're producing will be going up. And here's a picture of the tunnel boring machine that was used to tunnel under the city and bring more water into the hydro reservoir.
But could some of that water that you're pointing to come from the Welland Canal, which would drain extra water from Lake Erie?
So the Welland Canal isn't used for that. So the Welland Canal now needs its water so it can get ships up and down the escarpment.
Okay.
But there is the Welland River that does help feed the pumped storage reservoir. And one of the curious things about the Welland River is it goes at different directions at different times of the day, depending upon what OPG are up to. So on occasions, it appears to be flowing upriver because OPG are loading something with water, and it raises the height and the river flows in the wrong direction.
Do you know what company produced the power generators both on the Canadian and the American sides?
I don't know who produced the generators. I'd be prepared to bet General Electric, GE were involved somewhere down the road.
That's why I was thinking at least on the American side it'd be GE probably.
Well, GE were big in Canada as well.
Oh, were they?
And so as you will see, GE Canada played a major role in setting up the CANDOs. Well, I thought we did. I definitely remember investigating that. Let's see where we go. Right, this is where I had the CO2 emissions. So, because Richard asked about whether we use gas to produce power, and this is a subject that's very close to my heart because I went to Queen's Park Queen's Park is where the Ontario Parliament is, and I gave a presentation to them, and I basically said, if you are not careful and build nuclear now, then in 10 years' time, you will be one of the few jurisdictions in the world that is increasing your CO2 output per head of population. And you will do that because you will need to burn gas in order to supply electricity. And I was told that that would not be the case. And guess what's happened, guys? Our CO2 emissions are increasing because we are having to build gas plants in order to produce electricity, because wind and solar did not do what they told us they would do and provide the reliable electricity, clean electricity that we would need. So they managed to delay us building nuclear plants, and as a result, we've had to build gas. So this gives you a bit of a breakdown. If you look at the sort of pie chart that's in with the blue background, that's the connected capacity. And you can see that we have about 35% of our connected capacity is nuclear. Gas, there's really no oil. Gas is about 27% of our connected capacity. Hydro is 23%, wind 13%, and solar 1%. There are people out there that think that we can produce all of our electricity with solar and that it will solve all of our problems. I think that gap of understanding that everything we've done to date gives us 1% of our connected capacity kind of puts paid to that story. the pie chart below it, and this is a really important distinction to start understanding here, is how much electricity is generated in a year by those different sources, where you see nuclear was 35% of installed capacity, so that's how much can be produced, but it actually produces between 50 and 60% of the electricity we use, depending upon the year. Wind, that is 13% of installed, only produces 8%. And then gas comes off really badly. Its installed capacity is 27%, but actually it's only used to produce about 13% of our electricity. And that's because it's a peaking plant. So we only turn it on when we absolutely need it. So gas always looks bad because its capacity factor is low, but it's not because it's unreliable or unavailable. It's because we don't want to use it unless we have to. Here's some comparisons of CO2 emissions that show which I was talking about earlier. I knew I had the slide. That compares Ontario with some of the nuclear jurisdictions and showing just what a benefit having a large nuclear fleet has. I mean, as you've seen, we've got hydro, which is beneficial, but it's really nuclear that is keeping our emissions down. So in 2021, our CO2 emissions grams per kilowatt hour in Ontario were 28, whereas in Indiana they were 730.
And notice that Wisconsin is second only to Indiana. We are one dirty state.
Yeah. So this is something like we were not proud of this for the longest time, but our government is now getting to realize this is a figure to be really proud of.
Yeah.
It does cause us the problem. It causes the problem that I was pointing out to the government, that if you're really clean to start with, it's hard to get cleaner. So, it's really easy for Indiana to reduce its emissions. It's not so easy for Ontario to reduce its emissions. And the problem, as you can see, is that because we didn't build nuclear, so the graph at the bottom here is showing over time, has not all the data on it, but these are the emissions, and they go down and then they start going up again. So that's because we're having to build new gas plants, and the risk is that if we don't get nuclear up and running quickly, we're going to have to start using gas for our base load. So that means that our emissions will start rising quite dramatically, because not only do we have more gas capacity, but we are using it more to keep us in power. And it's a hugely debated issue. So, suddenly we're going from not using fossil fuels a lot to using fossil fuels a lot, when the world wants us to go in the other direction. So it's really drawing attention to the issue. And every day goes by, somebody wants to install install a gas-fired power plant, and there are huge fights over whether or not it should be done. And basically, I just look at everyone and smile and said, this decision was taken 12 years ago, when you decided not to build a nuclear power plant, because if you had, we'd now have plentiful clean electricity and you wouldn't need to worry about it. But they didn't. Oh, and here's just a headline that I pulled out that sums the whole position up. Big fights going on over this. Could have been avoided. Government will tell you they couldn't have predicted this, and I'm going to say you absolutely could have predicted it, because there was no other answer to the question. So they didn't listen. What can you do?
Yes.
Again, I in my investigations, I pulled this out because I find some of the misleading of the public that goes on. So this is actually the definition of different power sources by our IESO, the Integrated Electricity System Operator. So it should be the source of reliable information. And they define 3 forms of electricity production. So baseload generation, which is nuclear and coal, or what was coal, stuff that is very expensive to build, but then very cheap to operate. So you want to keep it operating all of the time. They then talk about the intermediate and peaking generation. So the stuff like gas that we've talked about, that can be relatively cheap to build, but may be expensive to operate because of the fuel. But you don't worry about that because you don't operate it all that often. And then the last capacity, the last one that they introduced is variable but controllable generation, which is covering wind and solar farms. And so when they say variable controllable, it implies that it's available all the time. And then the story they give is how they can turn it on and off as though it was peaking plant. But actually nowhere does it say that most of the time when you need it, it isn't available. And so I find this to be, it's telling the truth, but it's misleading the public. And the problem is that the public and governments make decisions based upon messaging like this, and it's wrong. So I have run a campaign, and I might have shared it with you, to stop calling wind and solar renewable, because that's a much larger category that includes reliable renewable generation like hydro and geothermal, which is useful stuff. And that we should start calling it what it is, which is unreliable generation, because that's its defining characteristic. You cannot rely on it.
We've been trying to use the word clean and then make sure that everybody knows that nuclear is clean along with wind and solar. Right. I don't know if that works. Does that work a little bit there?
We now have nuclear. For the longest time, nuclear was not considered to be clean. And the government had basically changed the law in order to include nuclear as a clean technology. So we can regard it as clean. And that's important. That distinction is important. But in terms of managing grids, the important feature of the defining characteristic of wind and solar is that you cannot rely upon them when you might need them. And I think we've talked about this previously, but I think one of the things people don't understand is that weather patterns are not helpful to wind and solar. So we have 2 peak days in Ontario. They are a winter day when it is cold and crisp. And there is no wind. And we have a summer day and it is hot and sultry and there is no wind. And both of them are caused by high pressure systems. And high pressure systems are large. So it's not just that the windmills are not turning near you, they're not turning anywhere nearby, and they are slow moving. So it's not just that they're not turning today, they won't be turning tomorrow, and they won't be turning the day after. And that's for both peak days. So when electricity is at its highest demand, wind and solar are absent from the system. And I've been telling people this for a long time, and you can't change it. It's the way weather works. And Alberta last year had a massive problem because they had that settled cold weather, no wind, and they were at risk of brownouts, potentially blackouts, at which point people are going to die because it's that cold, right? And so if you want a reliable system, you have to understand that no amount of wind and solar is going to get you through that problem, and no amount of storage is going to get you through that problem either, because the demand is so high. So they have a place within a system, but it has to be balanced with all the other things that are going on. The idea that at any time in the near future, you're going to build a reliable system out of wind, solar, and storage is just, it's just not taking account of the realities of electricity systems. So anyway, I wanted to highlight this because it shows how people can be misled. Everything that the electricity system operator has said there is true. It just leads you to a misleading conclusion. And I was stunned to find it there. And it's clearly done for political purposes to try and make that form of generation seem acceptable.
Thank you for that. That's a wonderful slide.
Right. So this was a fun one because I didn't know the answer to this question. So did Canada help Pakistan get the bomb? And Richard asked me that one directly. So I went in to investigate. And here are some of the facts that kind of lead you to asking the question. So there is absolutely no doubt that Canada supplied Pakistan with a CANDU reactor, signed the contract in 1965 and delivered power in 1972. So we did give them nuclear knowledge, nuclear know-how, and the capacity to generate electricity for civil uses. As to whether CANDU gave Pakistan the bomb, we can add to the fact that actually it was a GE machine that we supplied to them. So America is culpable in one way or the other. The system was covered by IAEA, so it's being inspected by the safeguard system, and the IAEA know that none of that material from that CANDU has been used as weapons making material, and in fact they supported the program in Pakistan. So internationally, we were encouraged to supply them with a CANDU, with the world confidently expecting they wouldn't use that material for bomb-making material. As soon as India detonated the Smiling Buddha, Canada went into basically a panic, and we withdrew any support from India and Pakistan to support their nuclear programs. And since we withdrew, Pakistan has gone on to establish its own ability to build and operate nuclear power stations. So in many ways, by withdrawing support, we have encouraged them to develop their own capabilities. So that's kind of the story around the CANDU in Pakistan. I then went into, what people actually think about how Pakistan ended up with a nuclear weapon. So here are the other bits of the story. Pakistan's weapons were made with enriched uranium mined and processed in Pakistan. So they didn't use plutonium from research reactors. So they didn't use any of the CANDU material. They used stuff that they made themselves and from plutonium from research reactors. The research reactor, again, I'm afraid America is culpable rather than Canada in supporting the Pakistan nuclear weapons program, in that the research reactor they used to make the plutonium came from America. The enrichment technology they used to enrich the uranium and make an enriched uranium bomb came from Urenco in the Netherlands. They stole that. Urenco did try and prevent them getting it, but they were able to get their hands on it regardless. In terms of the reprocessing technology that allowed them to take the plutonium that they had produced in their research reactor and turn it into weapons material, that came from the United Kingdom and France, and that was actually supplied to them as a program to help them reprocess fuel. So that was sold to them legally, and they then used that to make a weapon. So Canada has some culpability. America has a lot of culpability. The Netherlands have some culpability in that they didn't keep tight enough control on their information. The UK and France actually sold the stuff to them. And then to bring it all together, the Manhattan Project that they stole material from, and the Chinese taught them how to take the reprocessed material and take it into a bomb. So I found a quote that kind of summed it up from the New York Times, which said, "The United States provided Pakistani nuclear scientists with technical training from the 1950s to the 70s, and it turned a blind eye to the nuclear weapons program in the 80s because Pakistan was providing a crucial link to the CIA's effort to smuggle billions of dollars of weapons to Afghan guerrillas attempting to drive out Soviet invaders." So I think as a Canadian, I'm feeling quite good about this. And I think we can genuinely say we did nothing to give Pakistan weapons, and the rest of the world might like to take the splinter from their own eye before they try and take it back from us. No, it's the other. I used that analogy the wrong way around. Anyway, that gave me a warm feeling that I could genuinely say to people of Canada that wasn't really involved in giving Pakistan the weapon.
Thank you. Yeah.
And then that took me into, well, you know, if you had a can-do, would you make weapons out of it? So I've always, like, my friends at the IAEA Safeguards program disagree with me on this, and they're right, because they have to take a more serious view of it. But I use the analogy of if you are running away from a bear, you don't have to be the fastest runner, you just don't have to be the slowest. And that's the way you need to think about weapons making and proliferation. In that, why would people do it a difficult way if they can do it an easier way? So I looked into how easy it was to make weapons grade material using can-do reactors, and came to some interesting conclusions. So the first is that online refueling does actually give people the flexibility to trim their burn up in order to maximize the amount of weapons grade material that they use by shuffling fuel in and out of the reactor to make it produce plutonium effectively. So the design of the reactor, in principle, allows you to use it as a weapons grade material making machine. However, unfortunately, the refueling machines are notoriously unreliable. So we talked about the fuel shuffling, and that is a huge benefit of the nuclear reactor, of the can-do reactors. But the refueling machines are incredibly complicated and they break down a lot. So actually, one of the criteria that our nuclear operators use is it worth using the machine for this operation or not? Because every time you use it, there's a risk that you break it. So that's part of the criteria of understanding whether you should shuffle fuel or not. And that unreliability means that the flexibility of shuffling fuel is not really an advantage that a can-do would give to somebody in terms of making weapons material. So again, it shifts it away. Under normal operation, the can-dos are not really very good weapons grade material making machines, because you'd have to process 100 can-do fuel bundles to get amount of weapons material, compared with 2 for a PWR. So there's a lot more work to do. So I would argue that the can-do is not the slowest, as it runs away from the bear, and nobody would pick it in order to move forward with a weapons grade material production program. Nobody would use a PWR either. Actually, everybody would build themselves a research reactor. Any reasonable physicist can build a research reactor nowadays, and then you have immense flexibility to do whatever you want. So people talk about, and to back that up, so far as I'm aware, nobody has really used their civil program to make weapons grade material. They always do it via another route. We talked about the heavy water recycling, and as you said, in terms of the capital costs, 11% is in heavy water, and I actually answered this question earlier. You don't destroy it; you can recycle it and continue using it. All of the economics balance out because you don't have to enrich fuel. So the heavy water is more expensive. You don't have to enrich fuel. At the end of the day, the reactors end up costing about the same to build and operate. And this was the issue about the fuel. So although you have to use a lot more fuel, you actually mine 30% less uranium in order to get that fuel. So it's more efficient in use of natural resources, even though it appears that you're making a lot more fuel to operate the reactor. Now, Richard also asked about industrial heat, which, you know, when you think about the problem that the world faces, We are going to electrify things because that allows us to move away from the use of fossil fuels. But if we electrify and then make heat, it's kind of going against the nature of thermodynamics. So it would be great if we could use heat directly and start replacing some of the industrial heat processes where we use fossil fuels and use nuclear reactors to do it. And that largely depends upon temperature. So the output steam temperature on a CANDU is about 310 degrees centigrade. It's a little bit warmer than a PWR's at 285, and that's a little bit warmer than a boiling water reactor's at 275 degrees centigrade. And that's really going to define what industrial processes you can drive from a nuclear reactor and which ones you cannot. So I also looked into what industrial processes there were, and there's a lot of low temperature heat ones that you could drive with a nuclear reactor. So all the low temperature heat that we use for space heating, cleaning or washing operations, that sort of stuff, we could substitute fossil fuels with some kind of supply from nuclear reactors. And I think you've probably all heard about small modular reactors that would be built more locally. So that opens up the opportunity for getting steam at a reasonable temperature to a user as we have more reactors, more smaller reactors distributed around the country. We could also do some medium temperature heat. So a lot of food, textile, and chemical industries are using heat between, sorry, I should have been doing this in Fahrenheit, I hope you understand. I've got to speak in centigrade. I've lost my ability to understand Fahrenheit. Between 100 degrees and 250 degrees, there are quite a lot of industrial processes that you could just about get the steam from a CANDU to. And I don't think any of those are being done at the moment, but that theoretically they could be possible. And then we get to high temperature heat, which is really above 250 degrees C. So some of those you might be able to do with a CANDU and PWR, BWR, but actually by the time you've got losses with heat exchangers, you probably can't do any of those high temperature heat industrial demands with our current range of nuclear reactors. The exciting thing with some of the more advanced nuclear concepts, so if you use metal-cooled reactors, the sodium-cooled fast reactors, they have output steam temperatures at 450 degrees centigrade. So you could start doing all of your industrial heat applications, high temperature heat applications, other than metal melting and stuff like that. A large number of them could be done with those sorts of reactors. Molten salt cooled is even higher temperatures. They claim to go higher than that. I've used a conservative 550 degrees C. And when you get to high temperature gas cooled reactors, you can have whatever temperature you want. It's your ability to manage the heat exchange that becomes the issue. So I've put in 750 degrees C, but if you can manage the heat exchange, you could go higher than that. So that opens up almost every industrial process to being heated by some of these new advanced reactor concepts, if we can make them successful. The huge demand we have in Canada is the oil sands. And there they are using something called steam-assisted gravity drainage, where you actually produce steam, you pump it into the ground, that softens up the bitumen that's in the ground, and it allows it to flow. You then collect it, you can pump it, separate the water from it, and start recovering oil. Presently, we use gas to do that. I think any physicist that understands thermodynamics recognizes that using gas to produce oil is kind of not a very sensible thing to do. But it just happens that gas is co-located with oil, and so you could if you own the resource, then the gas is relatively cheap. So that's why they end up doing it that way. But it does mean that our oil sands have huge emissions associated with them. And for decades now, they have been looking into whether they could use nuclear to produce the steam for the oil sands. And steam-assisted gravity drainage needs 270 to 300 degrees C. So the problem with that is that you would have to, in order to get your 310 to produce the steam that you need, you'd have to be right next to the resource, and the resource moves, and nuclear plants are quite difficult to move. So they have tried to look at whether CANDU could be used for that purpose, but they've never used it. So that kind of sets the context. Is the heat from CANDU used? Well, CANDU heat has been used in a number of ways. The heavy water plant, which, as we've talked about, very energy intensive. One of the ways that you can cut down some of the electricity use is to use heat directly. And Bruce Power, when the heavy water power plant was operating up at Bruce Power, it's closed now and it's been decommissioned. That used heat from the reactors and electricity from the reactors to produce heavy water. So again, you can only put a heavy water plant where you have that heat and electricity. Putting it next to a nuclear plant made sense, and heat from the CANDU was used in the process. They also set up a scheme, and I tried to find more data on it, but I couldn't find any. I know I've had it in the past, but couldn't find it. But they set up some greenhouses up at Bruce Power, and they used waste heat. So rather than the heat from the reactors themselves, they used waste heat from the reactors, from the condenser, and they pumped the waste heat to greenhouses, to warm greenhouses, and improve the efficiency of operation of the greenhouses. I believe the scheme worked. I think for some reason it wasn't economic to keep doing it, and I don't believe it's in operation at the moment. So CANDUs have been used for industrial heat in very specific circumstances. They could be used more widely for that purpose. This has nothing to do with the presentation whatsoever, but I just found it really, really interesting. But at McMaster University, which is the nearest the university in Hamilton, not too far away from me, that I do quite a lot of work with, they've been working on this absolutely fantastic scheme, which I think deserves more attention. And that is to use waste heat from nuclear reactors and potentially heat from nuclear reactors to set up a grid system where you actually store heat when you're overproducing. And their football field currently has a waste heat store underneath it. And then a distributed system that has low temperature heat being supplied to buildings. And the buildings then have a heat pump in them, which operates off nuclear powered electricity, upgrades the heat to the temperature that the building needs. But it means that the heat pumps are operating quite efficiently because they work on the heat differential. So if you supply them with quite a reasonably high temperature heat in the first place, upgrade it with a heat pump, it's operating very efficiently to get heat into the buildings at the temperature you want it. Massively reduces the losses and allows you to use waste heat when it's available. And as we plan future towns, I think there's a very interesting scheme there that the rest of the world ought to be paying more attention to. So well done, McMaster University. Just wanted to give them a mention for some of the innovative thinking that's going on around energy systems. Right, so where are we with CANDU? We restructured our nuclear industry again, probably about 10 years ago, and we split our what used to be Atomic Energy of Canada Limited, that owned the rights to the CANDU technology, and they also operated all of our nuclear research and development and nuclear support systems. So they were doing the the testing that was needed to support the CANDU reactors. And we split it because the government at the time didn't want to continue investing in nuclear technology development, but recognized that all of the liabilities and the lab operations were really their responsibility. So they split it. They when they say sold off, we actually paid a company that was at the time SNC-Lavalin to take the nuclear technology away. So they were given all the rights to the CANDU, and the research facilities were all set up to a government-owned contractor-operated system, which ended up being operated by SNC-Lavalin as well. SNC-Lavalin have since changed their names, so they're now called Atkins-Realis, and they still own the CANDU technology, or they own the rights to the CANDU technology. Canadians still own the technology, but the rights to it rest with Atkins-Realis. They were left a little bit asleep at the wheel, so they didn't invest in the CANDU technology in the way that we had hoped they would. And now when the renaissance of the nuclear industry is really kicking into action and we're looking to build new reactors, they are struggling to catch up with their design. It is behind where Westinghouse are and where GE are with their designs. So they're struggling to catch up, but they are now promising a new machine called the CANDU Monarch, and they have a lot of support from Canadians. We obviously love the CANDU technology in order to try and get that accelerated so that we can include that in the offering for the future. So that is where the future of CANDU lies. Atkins-Realis have put quite a lot of money in themselves, but they are now going back to the government to say, you know, we really need some money from you to make a success of this. Can you fund us? Which would basically put us back to where we were in the beginning, funding the development of reactors. It's just that now a commercial company will benefit from it rather than the nation benefiting from it. So that's where we are. And at the moment, we are waiting to see whether that happens. Bruce Power are planning to build new reactors. They have a program going on at the moment to look at 4,800 megawatts of new capacity. That would be 4 or 5 of these machines. Other people are obviously in the running for that, but that is stimulating a lot of interest.
Quick question. Why is that sheath there in the lower center? Why is it on an angle like that?
I think it's, do you mean the cutaway?
Yes.
Yeah, it's just to try and show it in an appealing light, to show what's.
That's not very reassuring.
It's okay. just meant to tilt it so that you can look at the internals of the reactor, which is the bit at the front of the picture, then to show that it has a containment vessel, and then that all of that the internals and the containment vessel slot into the circle, into the middle of the all of the facility, to try and make it into quite an attractive looking machine.
Somebody from advertising.
Someone from advertising. But I do think, you know, if you look at the picture on the left, at least they are trying to make them look attractive nowadays.
Yes, they are.
I hate to say it, but one of the nuclear industry's problems was it was run by engineers for the benefit of engineers, and they didn't care what it looked like as long as it worked. And the problem is with human psychology is if it looks ugly, that people will think it's bad. And we made our reactors look pig ugly. So we were like building an image that was going to be a challenge to get away from. And I just wished we'd spent, you know, a few $1,000s on some architects to say, why don't you make them look nice? Because I think it would really have saved a lot of money in the long run.
And now you're going to cover isotopes, which I think is so very important. So I'll look forward to that.
Right, you're moving me on quickly. So isotopes. So Can-do reactors are, because they have neutron availability and you can get to them, are remarkably good at making isotopes. And I don't know how much you know about isotopes, but I'm going to run you through a few of the things that are going on. So historically, can-dos have always been used to make something called cobalt-60. That it is a really easy thing to do. You just load cobalt into the adjuster rods, and you irradiate it, and then you pull them out through the adjuster rods, which were always part of the system. You've now turned cobalt-59 into cobalt-60, and it is a very concentrated source of gamma rays, which you can then use. So on the left-hand side, you can see the internals in the reactor that already exist that allow you to load cobalt in and out of the reactor. It comes out and it's pulled into the water cooled used fuel bays, and then you can manipulate it from there on in. I love the picture in the middle because there's actually the writing on it that says drop and run. So seriously, if you ever pick up a cobalt-60 source, drop and run. But by the way, it's probably a bit too late because these are very, very concentrated sources of gamma rays. And they are used in a whole variety of different ways for the health and safety of mankind. So one of the most famous ways is external beam radiotherapy, where you use concentrated beams of gamma rays to irradiate cancerous tissue to shrink that tissue and, if you're very lucky, completely destroy it. So some very sophisticated machines now using external beam radiotherapy to help cure disease. Cobalt-60 is used in basically just large sources with a conveyor belt that goes through the middle of them to sterilize medical equipment. So, we know a lot of metal equipment is done using heat, but you can't use heat on plastics and others, and often not on the packaging. Whereas here you can package up your scalpel blades, seal the package, then irradiate them using cobalt-60, and they come out the other end and they are sterile. And that allows surgeons to operate much more safely than they would be able to do without the access to that sterilization. And then the final use is in, not the final use, one other example use is in food irradiation, which is very valuable. A lot of foods would be destroyed by heat processes, but they come containing pathogens. So spices in particular could well have pathogens. You can irradiate them, kill all the pathogens, and then your spices become safe. But you can also improve the use of food efficiency. About a third of all the food we produce is wasted every year. But you can extend the life of foods without causing them any harm by irradiating them. And that is another use of cobalt-60. So I like to talk about these things because people are kind of scared of radiation because they know it's related to cancer, and it's an unfamiliar thing. You can't see it, you can't touch it, you can't taste it. And I don't think they're aware of how much we use it to do good things for us. And so a lot of people go on about, the risks of nuclear and the fact that it may kill people. The civil nuclear industry kills very, very few people, and yet it saves thousands of lives every year through some of these treatments and some of these processes. Actually, probably more like millions of years. We never get credit for the lives we save. Always get criticized for any harm that we do. This is an even bigger use of radioisotopes for the good of mankind. So if you want to know where blood is flowing and a whole variety of other tests, then you use something called technetium-99m. Very easy to monitor where it is through the body, and it's used in things like stress tests to make sure people's heart function is okay. Technetium-99m is used in 30 million patient examinations every year. It's a staggeringly useful tool for physicians. And you may remember a time, and I can't remember when it was, when there was an isotope crisis, because almost all of the world's technetium-99 was coming from, or a vast majority of it was coming from Canada, from our NRU reactor at Chalk River, and it failed, and there was a decision taken not to continue operating it. And so the world suddenly had a shortage and suddenly realized just how strategically important radioisotopes were in the medical, in healthcare. For a long time, the slack was taken up by a bunch of other research reactors from around the world. And that's a list of the research reactors that were operating. And for a long time, were the only other way of producing technetium-99, technetium-99m. And the problem with research reactors is there's not many of them. They're old, and they don't operate all of the time. They are taken down regularly to load experiments in order for them to allow them to do research. So the world got through the crisis, but it was managing a very, very limited resource. And it turned from an isotope crisis into a neutron shortage, as the world realized it didn't have enough access to neutrons to do the jobs that it wanted to do. Now, a lot of research programs were set up, so they managed the reactors better. They've worked out a way of making technetium-99m using cyclotrons. But one of the big game-changing things that has happened is, oh, I haven't got a slide on it. Oh, it has. On the right side here is OPG, working with BWXT, worked out how to make technetium-99m using a power reactor operating 365 days of the year with plentiful neutrons in it. So Darlington now has the capacity to make technetium-99m. And basically, with that ability, my understanding is they're still waiting to do it on a commercial basis because they have to get approvals for the processing that then takes place when it comes outside of the reactor. But basically, that one move has meant that the neutron shortage is over. That CANDU reactors can solve that problem for the world and ensure that our access to technetium-99m is available as much as we want, whenever we want it. There's a question I see there, Dorothy.
Oh, Dottie, go ahead.
Yes. Is Darlington one of the Canadian reactors? I wasn't, you put Darlington and I didn't associate it whether it was CANDU or not.
Yeah, sorry. So my apologies. I'm obviously so familiar with it, I sometimes forget. Darlington is one of our nuclear stations. We have 4 CANDU reactors operating at Darlington.
Thank you. Thank you.
So
And that's the one near Toronto on Lake Ontario?
that is on Lake Ontario.
Yeah. Yeah.
Short drive outside of Toronto, the bounds of Toronto. So,
Right.
So that's a massive step forward, solving that neutron crisis and allowing the world access to technetium-99. Now, then there are really exciting things happening in the isotope business. So it's taken off in recent years in terms of people realizing what other treatments there might be. So people started looking at lutetium-177, again, a reactor-produced isotope that is a beta emitter that you can attach to various probes that will go around the body and search out certain things in the body, and then the beta emissions will irradiate the locality, and so you can treat things directly. So one of the things they can attach the chemical to that carries the lutetium are cancer cells, and this is a picture of the red is showing the cancer prior to treatment and after treatment using lutetium, and you can see you can get massive shrinkage and the complete removal of some cancers. And there is a lot of work taking place on lutetium treatments at the moment. Presently, they can extend life by the figures are kind of six or 7 months, and you go, well, That's not very much. Why are people so fussed about that? But the fact is that at the moment, because it's only in clinical trials, or has been mostly in clinical trials, they only have approval to treat people after they've been treated with everything else. And so they're already have progressed quite a long way through the journey, and it's kind of desperation measures. When you talk to the physicians, they're all going, fairly soon we're going to be able to use this as the first treatment. We're going to demonstrate this is the first treatment. And they then think they'll be into curing disease and much greater extensions of lives because they won't be dealing with such a big problem in the first place.
If I may just add to that, you're absolutely right that these are used initially in what are called phase 1 trials, where they're looking for toxicity. And once those trials are over and they see that they're effective and not major toxicity, then they go on to the phase 2 and phase 3 trials. And those are yet to go. But I agree with you totally that lutetium is a very exciting front, and we've only begun to look at it.
Yeah, no, incredibly exciting. And but it would immediately have headed towards the problem with production capacity. So production capacity on the research reactors would be a real challenge for the same reasons that I mentioned for technetium. But it's an added challenge because lutetium needs higher irradiation doses to be able to deal with it. Now, although cobalt can be produced on a range of full-scale reactors, because it's in there and it's irradiated for a long period of time, and it's a solid and very easy. So you could theoretically do cobalt on other styles of reactors. CANDU just happens to be really easy to do it on. You'd have no access for short-lived radioisotopes. So obviously you're going to inject this into somebody. You don't want it to be around for a long time. So you need very short-lived isotopes. And that means you've got to shuffle material in and out of your reactor quite quickly in order to irradiate it and then get it out to the patient. So getting neutrons to do that was going to be a very great challenge. But once again, CANDU came to the fore, and Bruce Power are now producing lutetium on on 2 of their reactors, and they have plans to expand it so they can produce it on all of their reactors. So CANDU again is useful or lends itself to producing lutetium.
I have a question for Richard first, and then, so you have these phase trials. How long are each of them? And what if they don't work out? Then you're building up all this capacity for what? I mean, how long are these trials?
The trials you're talking about have been going on for decades and decades with other things. So there's a standard patient oriented series of rules and regulations on setting up phase 1, 2, and 3 trials that have been going on now for decades. And they're quite standardized, and I'm not quite sure that the aim of your question. Could you repeat that again?
Yeah, I mean, you're doing all these trials, and yet you're trying to build reactor capacity at the same time. And what if the two don't merge together? I mean, you would want to know that the trials are going to be effective first, right?
Yeah.
That's just a thought.
Yeah, no, it's a very good thought, and it's actually one of the massive challenges that the industry has, in that you need material to undertake the trials, and that can make them very, very expensive. But you can't go to until you have certainty that the trial is going to be successful, and you're making large quantities of it and bringing the price down. So it just brings massive uncertainty into the business. And it has been a huge problem for people in the past. The solution here on lutetium is that the results are all giving people confidence that they're going to need the capacity. And so they're prepared to install the equipment. And the great thing is actually because of the access that the CANDU reactor gives, it's not horribly expensive equipment to load this material into the reactor and then pull it back out of the reactor.
And the other thing is that many of these trials done with phase one are not costly at all. In fact, are no charge in the early phase one trials. And decades of patient protection are involved in this, Lou. I can assure you. I've been involved in some of these trials back in 1980 when I first came to Madison, and it's a very established, clinically protected scheme of doing medical research.
Very good. I mean, is that FDA or?
Oh yes, I worked for the FDA in determining some of the fees for these treatments. So I've been deeply involved as a consultant with them.
Okay. Wow. Is there a corollary to that in Canada, or is that
Yes.
FDA is, yeah, okay.
Yeah, so we have Health Canada who are our equivalent. So, and but it's more challenging to do trials in Canada because there's fewer of us, and sometimes when these early trials, you're looking for specific people, and so America can call across the entire nation, and it's easier for you to do that. It's one of our challenges. But Canada is becoming a powerhouse in these new isotopes. So between our CANDU reactors and our history, in it, we are becoming a powerhouse in isotope production and usage. So we have a next stage series of therapies, again being researched around the world, but we have a Canadian company that's one of the leaders in it, and they're moving from the beta emitters like lutetium, and there are other ones that people are researching that again could be produced in the CANDU reactors, other beta emitters that have various different advantages. So we could see improvements on the lutetium type approach, but there's also something now called a TAT. I've forgotten what the letters stand for. But anyway, they're now looking at using alpha emitters. So a beta will get carried by its chemical, attached to the cancer, and it will then deliver its energy within 1 to 2 centimeters of where it ends up. Whereas an alpha emitter will dump all of its energy, and it's a much greater amount of energy in the immediate cell to which it is attached. So it's even more, so that's what TAT stands for, targeted alpha therapies. And they are now looking at those, and the results, a much earlier stage, but the results of those show even better results than these. So some very exciting things happening in the isotope field. I haven't created a slide on it here because targeted the alphas are produced on cyclotrons rather than on reactors. So CANDU doesn't help with that. But it is another exciting thing that's happening in the radioisotope field.
Would the alpha emitters be from americium?
No, so the americium lasts too long, so you need a short-lived alpha emitter. And the one they are looking at the moment is actinium-225, which, going back to Richard's comment that the charge to the patients might be low, actinium-225 is the most valuable material on Earth at the moment. It is so difficult to produce. So if the actinium therapies are to be successful, we need to find a solution to mass production of actinium to pull that price down. Otherwise, it's basically going to be for Elon Musk, and nobody else is going to be able to afford it.
One more question on some of these radiopharmacology solutions here. The technetium, I believe the half-life is just a few hours, and I think the biological half-life, where it's no longer a danger to patients, is a day or less. How it would seem like the distribution chain would be pretty important for that, because it's gradually deteriorates very quickly. How does that work?
Yeah, so distribution chains are immensely important, and as you rightly rightly point out, technetium, it's not so much of a problem because you don't actually ship technetium 99M, you ship a generator. So the generator has molybdenum 99 in it, and it decays to technetium 99M. So you ship it to the radiopharmacy. The radiopharmacy then milks. We ship what we call a cow, which is then milked for its technetium 99M when it's needed. And the cows, I think, last for like 10 days, but the technetium lasts for only hours. So they pull it off when it's needed, inject it, do the test, and deal with it that way. Lutetium, the half-life is a little bit longer, so you can move it around the world, but you are losing a lot of it while you do it. So producing chemicals that you don't want in the decay chain. So getting it to where it's needed quickly is really, really important. And that's where, and the world doesn't seem to have seized on this yet. But as we talked about, we don't have a CANDU reactor design for the future. And yet I think the isotope side of things could be hugely valuable to countries if they want to secure supply, a local supply of these isotopes, which I think they are going to want in the future. Then CANDU could make a comeback. But nobody seems to be recognizing that huge value in terms of securing supply chains at the moment.
Well, it seems like from what Lou said before, the investment in something that is not yet proven could be a drawback for investments in a lot of these things. Whereas CANDU, it sounds like the capital costs are already expended, and so just the incremental research of some of these things would be fairly low. Is that correct?
Yeah, so it gets wrapped up with all of the other. So you wouldn't buy a CANDU just to make isotopes, but it could flip the balance of your choice of reactor, because now you have also you have a secure supply chain because you don't need to buy enriched uranium, so you're isolated from supply chain challenges on enriched uranium, and simultaneously you have got your own secure supply of isotopes that you might want for your healthcare system. So in making a decision about your power reactor, it could go, CANDU's got some advantages that we didn't previously see, and flip it to be CANDU favored and solve a lot of problems. But unless CANDU gets support, we're not going to see a future for CANDU, even though it has these advantages. Ironically, I talked about tritium right at the beginning, and tritium is a disadvantage to CANDUs at the moment, because you've got to clean the tritium up and reduce it and whatever. We have stored all of the tritium that we've recovered from heavy water. It's quite easy to store, so it's all been stored. But I think the first few of fusion experiments that are carried out on a big ITER tokamak will burn through all of the world's stores of tritium.
Wow.
So
Also, you can
could
link
suddenly be an advantage to producing tritium rather than a disadvantage towards it.
It's a small market, but you can link tritium to thymidine, which of course is a DNA precursor. And with that, you can label cells and do research. I used to work with tritiated thymidine in 1962 or so, and it's a wonderful marker for tracing cells as they go through the body. So there are all kinds of different uses of tritium.
Yeah, and in fact, when you get into the benefits of the isotopes have done us, as well as the direct diagnostics and cures that are created by the isotopes themselves, the research that they allow us to do have solved the found solutions to many other diseases. So one of the challenges with drug development is you can go through a process of working out the theory of what a drug might do, and then quite often they would inject it into humans, having done all of the work that leads up to that, and find that they make no difference to humans whatsoever. And one of the reasons that happens is that quite often the drug is filtered out by one of the human filters, our kidneys and livers and stuff like that, just immediately takes it out of the system and gets rid of it. And so one of the things that's very easily done with isotopes is you tag the isotope to the drug and inject it, and you see where it goes to. And if it all ends up in one of our filter systems and is ejected from the body, you understand why it's not working, and then you can start working on other approaches. But it's also it is used in a whole variety of research ways. And as Richard was saying, as the early DNA work was all done with tritium, so it allows us to understand DNA and start. I claim that it helped us solve the COVID problem because it gave us the knowledge that allows us to have the RNA vaccines. So nuclear industry has its footprint all over the place. Nobody ever mentions all of the good that it does, but it's really has had a dramatic effect on human health and safety that it doesn't get credit for.
Very good point. Thank you. Well,
I think we I have no idea how long I've been talking for, but the future that CANDO is bringing. So for a long time, you heard people talking about SMRs, but nobody was moving. Everybody was staring at everybody else going, we're not going to get into this next range of nuclear reactors until somebody else does. We want to see them prove it. And so in 2021, every country in the world was staring at every other country in the world going, you're going to do something, you're going to do something, and nothing was happening. And then Ontario Power Generation announced that they were going to deploy the GE BWRX 300. Initially, they said they'd build one at Darlington. We've got a licensed site there. And now they've said they're going to build 4, which is great news because they need to be built in fleets in order to make sense. Almost immediately thereafter, another province in Canada said, well, if you do, we'll follow suit. And then Poland gained interest. And then there's a long list of other countries that are now, moving towards or have made decisions to deploy SMRs. So Canada has, I think, played a huge role in breaking that logjam, having the guts to make a decision, move forward. That has opened the floodgates for the rest of the world to investigate SMRs. So taking credit for that. We have a lot of other work going on SMRs. So out in Saskatchewan, as well as the BWRX 300, we are looking to deploy a very neat little machine that Westinghouse have developed, a much smaller machine. So the BWRX 300 is 300 megawatts. Actually, I think it's 350 now. They've pushed it. Whereas the Evinci Westinghouse machine is a micro reactor at about 5 megawatts. So you just use that. That would do for like one company would have that, or you could have a few of them at a small university to provide all the needs. So Canada has taken a step forward to drive that one forward. In case you didn't know this, Westinghouse is now entirely Canadian owned. So it's owned by one of our investment companies, along with Cameco, our uranium producer. So Westinghouse may be based in America, but it's actually now entirely Canadian owned. And we're looking forward to deploying that. We're doing research on 2 advanced reactors, looking to try and deploy the ARC fast reactor out in New Brunswick. And Moltex, originally a UK company, but have set up have a lot of their operations in Canada, looking at a molten salt reactor that would actually, the intention is to use recycled CANDU fuel as the fuel source for that machine. So those are still in the research stages, but with an intention to deploy in New Brunswick. And then an American company, X Energy, is currently undertaking studies. They have a high temperature gas cooled reactor. So they're the ones with the like 750 plus degrees C, and they're looking at trying to deploy those in the oil sands to provide industrial heat and power to the oil sands. So there's, for a small country, we're punching above our weight on isotopes, and we're punching above our weight on reactor deployment, if not actually reactor development. So I think we're doing a lot for the world. And, you know, one of the things I've always said is that our emissions in Canada, although we are the biggest polluters per person, because we're cold and distributed and we've got the oil sands, so our emissions per person are very high in Canada. There aren't very many of us, so we actually don't make a great deal of difference to the world's emissions. So we could solve all of our emissions and emit nothing in Canada, and the world would barely notice. So I've always said the real thing that we should do with our wealth is help the rest of the world. And if we've broken the logjam and given the rest of the world encouragement to move forward with nuclear, with SMR projects, then I think we've really made a difference to the future of you know, reducing the challenge of climate change. And that's something I'm immensely proud of, although I don't think the rest of Canada appreciates what we might have done there yet.
Well, I sure do appreciate it. We've come to the
And then
2 hours.
You're probably saying this. I am definitely saying this. Phew, we got to the
Yeah.
end. So
And what a guy to get to say woo. Yeah, that's really great. I'm so grateful for your slides, for your talk, for your taking all that trouble to answer so many questions and many more that you drummed up. It was a wonderful, I think, in fitting into our Plato lecture series. And I want to thank you so much for doing that for us. I really appreciate it so much.
great. Well, I appreciate the opportunity to do it, and I just hope I didn't go on for too long. I have no clock or watch anywhere near me. I have no idea how much of your valuable time.
Your timing is right on. Your timing, you're perfect.
In which case, I rehearsed this very carefully, and I made sure I brought it in on time.
Yep, you did well, really well.
Thank you,
Great.
Neil.
Thank you all
Great
for
job.
listening to me.
Thank you.
Appreciate it.
Happy Thanksgiving, everybody.
Thank
Yeah.
you.
Thank
To
you. Terrific talk.
Wow. Wow.
And thank you, Richard, for the last time for our class. We'll miss our class.
Well, thank you, Duddy. I appreciate your expression, and it has been a real pleasure. It's been fun to do, and what a great way to send it off with this terrific conclusion. And so I'm ever so grateful to Neil and to all of you for stimulating me over the years. It's been a two-way street. So thank you.
Can I say something? For years, Richard has regaled us with can do, and you gave a really nice wrap up. I think I understand a lot better, despite Richard touting it for years. I now think I understand a lot better what it can do and how it works. So thank you very much, Neil, for the talk. Thank you.
Thank you.
We're here. Okay, well, so long, everybody.
Thanks so
All right.
much.
Bye-bye.
Richard, and
Thank
Richard,
you.
stay
Thank
in
you.
touch,
Thank you.
Richard.
Thank you.
Everybody keep in
Thank you.
touch.
Okay,
Bye then, everyone.
bye-bye,
Bye.
everyone. Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.